So you might remember back in February, I did a preview video on the brand new Zeiss Otus ML 50mm f1.4. That version that I had was a pre-production version, so it was just a preview video. I have since gotten a production version of this lens. I'm pleasantly surprised. Not only is it excellent, this has probably become one of my favorite lenses to use recently. So in this video, we're going to look at this a little more in depth. This is going to be a full review on this lens. So I do want to mention the Otus lens lineup for Zeiss. So the Otus lenses are all f1.4. They're considered to be the highest optical quality that you're going to get for whatever camera system it is. The new ML lenses are designed specifically for mirrorless. So this one that I have in this video is designed for Sony. There's also a Nikon Z-mount version of this lens, as well as a Canon R-mount. Now, all these lenses are based around the original Zeiss lenses that came out. This was the original Otus 55mm f1.4, which came out in 2013. These lenses were designed for DSLRs. You can also see that they are quite large. In fact, for many years, I actually used adapters for these to put them on my Sony cameras. And you can see that once you adapt one of these lenses, that they really are quite large. They're also very heavy, and they're not really practical in terms of a lens that would be portable. It ends up being a studio camera setup at this point. But this brings me to a point that the Otus series lenses were designed to just be the best optical quality possible. In fact, the design targets on these, when Zeiss were putting these together initially, were really, there were no holds barred. There were no restrictions on price. There was no restrictions on autofocus. In fact, they're all manual focus lenses. They just had to be the absolute best you could possibly get for any system. But having used all four of the lenses that Zeiss released back then, I absolutely love them all. But like I said, they're big, they're heavy, they become studio cameras. So this is why I was really excited this year when Zeiss announced that they were going to do mirrorless versions of these that were much smaller. So one thing that I want to make clear and get out of the way early in this video is this is a manual focus lens. There are reasons for it and reasons that one would want a manual focus lens. But if you are of the type that find difficulty in turning a tube or getting something into focus and you have to have an autofocus lens, this probably is not for you. Having said that, those of you who do enjoy manual focus, and I love manual focus because I like to be in control of the focus point, I also like the mechanical build. This is not focused by wire. Everything is actually mechanical in the lens itself. They have done a wonderful job with this, and so this has a lot of applications for people who want to use manual focus for photography, but also for video work. And like other Zeiss lenses, if you were familiar with the Loxia lineup, it does have the little key in the box, and so on the back of the lens there's a little place where you can actually declick the aperture. So if you want to use this for video applications, and that is important, it is declickable. Now, a lot of cameras, and in this case Sony, out of the box, the way it works with manual focus lenses with electronic contacts is that as soon as you turn the lens to focus, it actually does the focus magnifier where it zooms in. I don't particularly like that or find it useful because I don't always want that in play, and I might not have the focus point selected, and sometimes you just touch the lens and it gets a little jumpy on you and it activates when you don't intend for it to do. So I actually turn that off. What I like to do, especially on this camera, is I actually assign one of the custom function buttons to be the focus magnifier, and then you can actually select the initial magnification also. So when I press this button, it immediately zooms in, and I press it again, it zooms out. So I am in control of when I need to punch in for critical focus. The focus on here is extremely smooth, and depending on how you have your viewfinder set up and if you've dialed in the diopter, I really don't need to zoom in for critical focus all that much, and I haven't had problems with shooting motion. Now, a lot of this does require practice and a little bit of technique from the photography side of things, but it's very easy to use. So the other thing that I mentioned in my preview video is there's this thing that people refer to as the Zeiss look. Now, that may be different things to different people, but for me personally, it's a couple things. First of all, it is very bold colors that these lenses will reproduce. The Zeiss look for me really is personified in the f1.4 lenses, and there's been f1.4 lenses across the Zeiss range, from the Milvus lenses to the older lenses, obviously the Zeiss Otus lenses. The Otus lenses produce this in spades, and what they do is actually design these so you have incredibly high resolution right at the point of focus, and this is countered by an immediate fall off in resolution as soon as it goes into the out of focus area. So you get a really nice subject isolation, particularly at medium distances. So this immediate drop in resolution creates a lot of contrast in the depth of your image, and a lot of people call this the 3D look. It's really quite beautiful. This is not specific to Zeiss. There are other lens manufacturers in the modern age that design optics in this way. If you look at Leica with the Apo Summicron series of lenses, those are f2 lenses that really don't behave like f2 lenses visually because of that drop off. It really is wonderful, and it really looks good at f1.4. If you look at portraits, you can have the eye exactly in focus, and as soon as you go out to the shoulder, it starts to drop off focus. So it's a really beautiful portrait lens. And like I said, it's particularly useful if you've got a subject that you're trying to isolate from the background. You don't have to be that close to it. It really does have a nice separation. So a few points about this lens lens. First of all, the weight comes in at 700 grams. While it's not the lightest lens in the world, it's still very manageable and much more portable than its DSLR counterparts were. The lens design features 14 elements in 11 groups. 2 of these elements are aspherical, and there are 4 special glass elements. Another thing worth mentioning is there are 10 aperture blades that are rounded. The aperture assembly in here is very well designed, and so things stay round with your spherical highlights, especially when you're stopped down to f2 to f4 range. Minimum focus on this lens is 50 centimeters or around 1.6 feet, so you can get in fairly close to subjects. As I mentioned earlier, the aperture is declickable, so this is really handy if you're shooting video and you just want a smooth aperture transition across the board. Now, I do want to note a major difference in the optical quality between the pre-production lens that I did my preview on and this being the actual production lens, because it is a little bit different. One of the things that I noted in that video that I did in February is that I was getting what looked like chromatic aberration. I was getting just a slight red edge at times on high contrast areas, and I also mentioned that you could clean it up simply by stopping the lens down. Now, credit where credit is due, I did receive a comment on that video from Pedrova8058, who made a couple comments about this lens. First of all, chromatic aberration doesn't change with aperture, and he is correct. It doesn't clean it up exactly. So what we're actually seeing here is an aberration at full aperture that decreases when you stop down. This is probably due to residual spherical aberration, which is basically the red where the longer wavelength is slightly shifted, which is why you see that clean up between f1.4 and f2. One thing I want to note, I was being particularly hard on that first lens because, well, it's a Zeiss Otus and that's the top of the line, and I wanted it to be absolutely incredible. The other thing that I've noticed is I can't replicate it on the actual production version of the lens. So it could be a change that they had between pre-production or production. I don't know. It's probably more likely a copy variation, which is interesting to me, but either way, I am happy to report that I am not getting that at all with this lens, and that is a huge deal. This lens has performed absolutely fantastic. Another thing that's worth noting is that Pedrova8058 also made a note in the lens designs that if you compare them, it is obvious that the Zeiss has included more elements to reduce spherical aberration and coma. So in the old version, you've got these 2 thick elements, which are the 3rd and 4th elements, that are replaced by 4 thinner elements in the new design, and this is done to reduce spherical aberration. Basically, you have 2 thinner, less curved elements that replace 1 thicker, strongly curved element. And he also noted that the same as the doublet in position 6 and 7 in the old design, and the much more thinner and flatter in the new lens. The reason I mention this is that Zeiss clearly put a lot of thought into this new design. It's one thing to make a mirrorless lens out of what was originally a DSLR lens, but they kind of kept the same formula and expanded on it a little bit, and they've done a wonderful job. The sample images that I'm getting out of here, I've just fallen in love with this lens. It has a beautiful look to it. Now, another thing that's very impressive about the Otus lenses in general is if you look at these historically in the history of lens design, we had this point with the early DSLRs where all of a sudden it was possible through modern coatings, optical materials that we were able to use in terms of glass types, where we could design lenses that were just exceptional. And it used to be back in the old days, and I'm thinking like the 1960s or the 1970s, we were more limited with the technology and what could actually be produced and manufactured. So therefore, there was a time when you had slow film speeds, and the difference between f2 and 1.4 was getting the shot or not. This is totally different today because on older lenses, you'll notice that when you shoot them wide open at f1.4, lenses from the 60s, maybe the 70s, is that they don't resolve very well. You really do need to stop the lens down to start getting the best performance out of it. You also increase your depth of field. There's other things that come with that. So what the Otus lenses marked was this point in technology where we could actually shoot wide open with incredible image quality. And this is something that we tend to take for granted because it's so proliferated today. We have the technology and pretty much every manufacturer is doing something along those lines. So I appreciate what Zeiss are doing here. They've retained a little bit of that older look. It is not clinical. It is not cold. It looks absolutely fantastic. And we've got these on mirrorless system lenses now. So a few things that I want to mention. What I really love about this lens, first of all, the way it renders, the optics, the look is exceptional. Even better than that is compared to the DSLR version, we now have something that is small and portable. This is interesting because when you look at other systems, and I'm thinking about Leica here, when we have lenses that were designed for rangefinders, they're a lot smaller because they have to be. So the whole idea of a rangefinder, you're going to block the optics if you have a lens that's too large. So there are limitations on what can be designed at those smaller sizes. They're wonderful lenses. They're incredible for what they do. But that's why Leica put out the SL series of lenses, because they're able to do more. They're bigger. They're studio lenses. They're not designed to be portable. And so what we have is something similar with Zeiss, where we have the older versions of these lenses that are big, and then now we have the smaller versions which are portable. And I think Zeiss has done a wonderful job, especially because it's mirrorless. I'm not having to block a rangefinder, so it can be a little bit bigger than rangefinder lenses and you retain more of that look overall, and Zeiss have done a fantastic job with this. And then finally, I want to say that the build quality on this lens is absolutely fantastic. A lot of lenses, when they're mass produced by camera companies, tend to be a little bit plasticky feeling because they're trying to keep the lens lightweight. There are shortcuts that are made. There's things like focus by wire, which is not a poor design. It's just a necessary design for a mirrorless system because of the way you have autofocus motors now. It's so nice to have a lens that is this well built, that is this well thought out. It's solid without being too heavy. The build quality is outstanding. Now, there are a few little nitpicky things that I do think are worth mentioning about this. First of all, I want to say that I think it is absolutely awesome that Zeiss have made this lens not only for Sony E mount, but also for Nikkor Z mount as well as Canon R. What is missing is L mount, and I think that that's unfortunate because when you look at what Leica have done with the SL cameras in the last year, and really what Panasonic have done this year with the S1R2 as well as the S1 II, I think they're making some amazing stuff, and I would love to be able to use these lenses on those systems. Unfortunately, we're in the mirrorless zone now, so everything is proprietary again. It's not easy to adapt, or sometimes it's impossible to adapt in the case of L-mount. There are probably some reasons why. I know that L-mount Alliance is probably pay to play, but it really would be cool to see the Otus ML lenses available in the L-mount ecosystem. One little nitpicky thing about the design itself is, well built as this is, where the aperture ring is and the way it kind of sits under your hand when you're shooting, it's really easy to knock this out because the stops aren't really tight. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's just the placement of it. So a lot of times I'll find myself at f1.6, 1.8, or maybe f1.2 when I mean to be wide open. So I've learned just to kind of check it. It's not the end of the world, but it's a good thing to know where your aperture is sitting. And I think a slightly tighter aperture collar could probably fix that. And finally, the Otus series of lenses is a series of lenses. And right now, the only one that's available is the 50mm. Zeiss have announced an 85mm, which I'm really excited to see because I think it's going to be absolutely fantastic. In fact, the 85mm Zeiss Otus, the DSLR version, is probably one of my favorite lenses ever designed. Now, it is big and it is heavy, but optically it is gorgeous. That one is coming later this year, and then I have talked to Zeiss about this, and I think they are going to experiment with other focal lengths in this range. I think what's really cool about this is when you look at the DSLR Otus lenses, there were only 4 of those that were available. There's a 28, a 50, an 85, and a 100. I think it would be cool to look at options such as a 135. There was never a 35mm, or maybe even a 20mm. I think there's a lot of opportunity that Zeiss have with this, and much like the Loxia lenses and the other lineups that they've got, I really love the possibilities of what they can do with mirrorless. And they provide a different alternative for people who want to shoot manual focus, who want a different kind of look to the lenses they have that's a little bit less clinical. This is a great way to go. Now, in terms of alternatives, I'm going to keep this pretty brief here because when you talk about Zeiss Otus lenses, it's a really specific design with a really specific set of design targets, and it represents the best of the best. And the only thing I could compare this to would be the older DSLR Otus lenses, and you could adapt those. However, if you look at this from a different perspective and you want really incredible lenses designed for mirrorless, and maybe you want something smaller, the one I would recommend is this, which is the Loxia 50mm. This is one that I have loved. This was one of the first Loxias that was made. It's extremely small. It's extremely lightweight. It's an f2, and the rendering on here is gorgeous. This is a really good alternative if you want something smaller in the system. It's still with a high resolution that has a great look to it. Zeiss Loxia are the way to go. This is a planar, which is a very simple design. It's essentially a double Gauss, but it's one of my favorite lenses for this system. So I think there's a lot of cool things that we're going to see with Zeiss coming up. If you guys have any questions, drop them in the comments. I will catch you guys in the next video. Until then, later.